In the summer of 1916, in a modest boarding house room on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, an old woman lay dying. The room was unremarkable worn furniture, faded curtains, the kind of place a clerk or retired schoolteacher might call home. There was no elegance here, no grandeur, nothing to suggest that the occupant was anything other than ordinary. Visitors who climbed the narrow stairs would have found nothing to indicate extraordinary wealth. No silk draperies, no servants in livery, no fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases. Just an elderly woman in a plain black dress, surrounded by newspapers, account books, and the stubborn conviction that she knew best. Her name was Hetty Green, and at that moment she was worth more than $100 million. In today's currency, that fortune would approach $3 billion, enough to purchase influence, comfort, and security beyond measure. To put that figure in perspective, in 1916, the average American worker earned perhaps $800 a year. A comfortable middle-class home might cost $3,000. The most luxurious hotels in Manhattan charged $10 a night for their finest suites. Hetty Green's fortune, carefully invested in railroads, real estate, and government bonds, generated more income in a single day than most families would see in a lifetime. She was, by nearly every measure, the richest woman in America, perhaps the richest woman the country had ever produced. And yet the room where she spent her final weeks looked nothing like the marble halls of the Vanderbilts or the gilded parlors of the Astors. It would not have passed muster even among the servants' quarters of such estates. There were no Tiffany lamps casting jeweled light across Persian carpets. There was no army of maids and footmen waiting on her every need. The furniture was second-hand. The meals were simple, and when doctors came to examine her failing heart, Hetty Green, worth more than some small nations, argued about the cost. This was the woman the newspapers called the Witch of Wall Street. The name had stuck. The nickname was not meant kindly. For decades, Hetty Green had been the subject of fascination, ridicule, and no small amount of fear among the financiers of New York. She was a woman who operated in a world designed by men and for men, and she did so with a ruthlessness that would have been admired in a Rockefeller or a Morgan, but was considered unseemly in someone who wore a bonnet and petticoats. She bought when others sold when others bought, and never under any circumstances paid more than she had to. The stories about her frugality became legend, growing stranger with each retelling. It was said that she wore the same black dress for years, washing only the hem to save on cleaning costs. That she heated her oatmeal on the office radiator to avoid buying fuel. That she moved from one cheap boarding house to another across New Jersey and New York, never staying long enough for anyone to discover her true wealth and raise the rent. That she conducted business in the vault rooms of banks, not for security, but because they were the only places that offered free heat and light. Some of these stories were true, others were exaggerated. A few were almost certainly invented by journalists who understood that a miserly millionairess made better copy than a merely cautious investor. But the most troubling tale of all, the one that would follow Hetty Green into history and define her legacy in the public imagination, concerned her son Edward. According to the legend, young Ned Green injured his leg as a child in a sledding accident, and Hetty, unwilling to pay for proper medical care, allowed the injury to fester untreated for years. She supposedly took him to free clinics, dressed herself and her son in rags to appear impoverished, until the damage was beyond repair. The leg was eventually amputated below the knee. The story painted Hetty as a monster, a woman so consumed by greed that she would sacrifice her own child's limb to save a doctor's fee. The truth, as is often the case, was more complicated. Ned Green did lose his leg, and Hetty did seek out inexpensive treatment in the early stages of what may have been a bone infection. But medical records and family accounts suggest that the full story involved misdiagnosis, the limitations of 19th century medicine, and a good deal of embellishment by hostile reporters who had long wanted a reason to despise her. Hetty Green was many things: difficult, obsessive, suspicious of anyone who might part her from her money. But whether she was the villain of that particular story depends on which version one chooses to believe. What is undeniable is this: Hetty Green lived as though she were poor, even as her fortune grew to almost incomprehensible proportions. She denied herself pleasures that women of far lesser means enjoyed without a second thought. She wore clothes that would have embarrassed a factory worker's wife. Her wardrobe was rumored to contain exactly one dress at any given time. She ate in cheap restaurants, traveled in ordinary railway cars, and kept her residences deliberately humble and frequently changed to avoid attention and taxation. Why? What compels a person to accumulate one of the largest fortunes in American history and then refuse to spend a single penny of it on comfort or pleasure? Was it madness? Was it principle? Was it some wound inflicted so early in life that no amount of money could ever heal it? These are the questions that Hetty Green's strange existence poses to anyone who tries to understand her. She was not merely frugal. She was aggressively, defiantly, almost religiously opposed to spending. And that opposition came at a cost not just to her own happiness, but to her relationships, her reputation, and ultimately her children's ability to live normal lives in the world their mother's wealth had created for them. In the boarding house room where she lay dying, surrounded by the account books she had studied more carefully than any novel, Hetty Green remained true to herself until the very end. She questioned the bills. She doubted the doctors. She held on to her money as though it were the only thing that had ever truly loved her back, the only companion that had never betrayed her. She died quietly on July 3, 1916, at the age of 81. Her fortune, estimated between $100 and $200 million depending on how one valued her vast real estate holdings, passed to her two children. They would spend it with an enthusiasm their mother would have found horrifying. But that is a story for later chapters. First, we must go back to the whaling ports of New Bedford, Massachusetts, in the years before the Civil War, where a young girl with keen eyes and a sharp mind first learned that money was not merely useful but sacred. Back to the Quaker family that made her, the seafaring fortune that shaped her, and the cold lessons that would consume the rest of her extraordinary life. The city of New Bedford, Massachusetts, in the 1830s and 1840s, smelled of money. It was not the perfumed, abstract money of bank vaults and stock certificates. It was money you could touch and smell: whale oil rendered from blubber, spermaceti refined for candles, baleen stripped and sorted for corsets and umbrella ribs. The harbor bristled with masts. Ships arrived from voyages that had taken them around Cape Horn, across the Pacific, into Arctic waters where icebergs loomed and storms could swallow a vessel whole. Fortunes rose and fell with each returning ship. The counting houses along Union Street hummed with the scratch of pens and the rustle of ledgers. And in one of those counting houses, a young girl with serious eyes sat at her father's desk, learning to read numbers before she learned to love stories. Henrietta Howland Robinson was born on November 21, 1834, into a family that had turned the slaughter of whales into one of the great fortunes of antebellum America. Her father, Edward Mott Robinson, was a partner in Isaac Howland Jr. and Company, one of New Bedford's most prosperous whaling operations. The company owned multiple vessels, employed hundreds of men, and maintained complex financial relationships with suppliers, insurers, and merchants across the Atlantic world. Her mother, Abby Slocum Howland, came from the Howland family itself, a dynasty whose ships had sailed for decades to the Pacific, the Arctic, and every dangerous sea in between, returning with holds full of oil that lit the lamps of a growing nation. Together, the Howland and Robinson clans represented the very pinnacle of New Bedford society, though they would never have described themselves in such terms. New Bedford in those years was remarkable. By the mid-19th century, it had become one of the wealthiest cities per capita in the United States, perhaps in the entire world. The whaling industry had concentrated extraordinary riches into this small Massachusetts port. Grand homes lined the main streets, built by captains and merchants who had made their fortunes in the dangerous trade. Banks proliferated to manage the wealth. Insurance companies prospered by underwriting the risky voyages. The city hummed with commerce, and at the center of that commerce stood families like the Howlands and the Robinsons. They were Quakers, and their faith shaped everything about how they lived, worked, and thought about money. The religious society of Friends had long been associated with commerce and prosperity. Denied access to universities and many professions because of their beliefs, Quakers had turned to business and excelled. Their reputation for honesty made them trusted partners in trade. Their emphasis on education, including the education of women, produced sharp and capable minds, and their theological commitment to simplicity kept them from squandering their earnings on the ostentation that defined other wealthy American families. There were no gilded mirrors in Quaker homes, no elaborate dinner parties with dozens of courses, no balls or cotillions or seasons in Newport. The Quaker way emphasized plainness, humility, and the inner light of conscience over outward display. Wealth was not for flaunting, it was for stewardship. To waste money on frivolity was not merely foolish but spiritually dangerous, a sign of vanity that endangered the soul. And to accumulate money through honest labor and careful investment was a form of godliness, a visible sign of discipline, prudence, and divine favor. This was the world into which Hetty Robinson was born, and from her earliest years she was trained not for the drawing room but for the counting house. Her education differed dramatically from that of other wealthy girls of her generation. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, the daughters of the rich were taught to play piano, to speak French, to embroider and paint watercolors, accomplishments designed to attract suitable husbands. They learned to dance, to manage servants, and to navigate the complex social rituals of their class. Their value, in the eyes of their families and society, lay largely in their ability to marry well and produce heirs who would continue the family line. Finance was considered unsuitable for feminine minds. The stock market was a masculine mystery, too vulgar and volatile for delicate constitutions. Hetty Robinson received a very different preparation for life. Her father, Edward Robinson, recognized something unusual in his daughter from an early age. She was quick with figures, attentive to detail, and possessed of a fierce intelligence that unsettled some and impressed others. By the age of 6, she was reading the financial pages of the newspapers aloud to her grandfather, Gideon Howland, whose eyesight was failing. The old man would sit in his chair, listening as the child worked through shipping reports and market prices, asking questions that tested her understanding. By 8, she was following the reports with genuine comprehension, understanding which voyages had succeeded and which had ended in disaster, which captains were reliable and which were reckless. By her early teens, she was sitting in on discussions of investments, insurance, and the complex logistics of the whaling trade. This was not a conventional girlhood, but the Howland and Robinson families were not conventional people. They were merchants first, and they understood that wealth had to be tended like a garden, constantly watched, carefully pruned, protected from pests and storms. A fortune left unattended could disappear in a single bad investment, a single unlucky voyage, a single fire or panic. The men of the family spent their days tracking every barrel of oil, every invoice, every debt owed and payment received, and Hetty, sitting among them, absorbed their methods completely. The whaling industry itself was a brutal, high-stakes business that rewarded patience, risk tolerance, and meticulous record-keeping. A single voyage might last 3 or 4 years, sending a ship and crew to the far side of the world in pursuit of whales that were becoming increasingly scarce. The initial investment was enormous. The ship itself might cost $20,000 or more. Provisions for years at sea added thousands more. Wages for the crew had to be guaranteed, and insurance was indispensable. Returns were deeply uncertain. Some voyages came back laden with thousands of barrels of oil, making fortunes for their investors. Others returned empty, their crews decimated by disease or shipwreck. Some ships never returned at all, vanishing into the vast and indifferent sea. To succeed in this business required a particular kind of mind, one that could calculate probabilities, weigh risks, and make decisions without sentiment. Hetty watched her father and grandfather do exactly this year after year. She saw them study reports from captains in the Pacific. She saw them negotiate with refiners and insurance agents. She saw them write off losses without flinching and reinvest profits without celebrating. Money, in the Howland household, was not a source of pleasure or display. It was a responsibility, a test, a sacred trust that demanded constant vigilance. The lessons sank deep. There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, that Hetty once told an interviewer she had learned to read from the financial pages because there were no storybooks in her grandfather's house. Whether literally true or not, the anecdote captures something essential about her formation. While other girls were reading fairy tales about princes and castles, Hetty Robinson was studying commodity prices. While they dreamed of romance, she dreamed of compound interest. The stories she absorbed were not about love or adventure, but about ships and cargoes, profits and losses, the cold mathematics of risk and reward. Her mother, Abby, was a quieter presence, sickly, often confined to her room and largely absent from Hetty's practical education. The relationship between mother and daughter appears to have been distant, defined more by Abby's chronic illnesses than by warmth or intimacy. When Abby died in 1860, Hetty was 25 years old and already deeply immersed in the family business. Her father had come to rely on her judgment, consulting her on investments and trusting her opinions on matters that most men of his generation would never have discussed with a daughter. She was not merely trained, she was tested, and she had passed. The fortune she stood to inherit was substantial but not limitless. The whaling industry, which had made New Bedford the richest city per capita in America, was already beginning its long decline. Petroleum, first discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859, would soon replace whale oil as the country's primary source of illumination. Kerosene was cheaper, cleaner, and more convenient. The families that had built their wealth on whaling would need to adapt or watch their fortunes evaporate. Some would fail, clinging stubbornly to the old ways. Others would diversify into railroads, real estate, and manufacturing. Hetty Robinson would do more than adapt, she would thrive. But first, she would have to fight for her inheritance. Fight against the men who tried to cheat her. Fight against a world that believed women had no place in the brutal arena of high finance. The Quaker counting houses of New Bedford had given her the tools, discipline, calculation, suspicion of waste, and an unshakable belief that money was power, and power was survival. What they had not prepared her for was the courtroom battle that would consume years of her life, pit her against her own relatives, and harden her into the formidable, feared figure she would eventually become. That battle began with a death, a will, and a document that may or may not have been forged. It began with the Howland inheritance and with the first great contest of Hetty Robinson's long, strange, remarkable life. The inheritance should have been simple. In 1865, when Hetty Robinson's aunt Sylvia Ann Howland died at the age of 78, she left behind a fortune estimated at $2 million, a staggering sum that would have secured comfort for generations. Sylvia had never married, had no children, and had devoted her final years to charitable causes and the careful management of her wealth. Her niece Hetty, the only child of her late brother's line, was the natural heir. The money should have passed quietly from one generation to the next, as such fortunes often did in the tight-knit merchant families of New Bedford. Instead, there was war. Sylvia Howland's will divided her estate among several beneficiaries, including charitable organizations and distant relatives, leaving Hetty only a portion of the total rather than the whole. The terms were disappointing, but not entirely unusual for a wealthy woman who supported various charitable interests and felt obligations beyond her immediate family circle. What happened next, however, would shock New Bedford society, dominate local newspapers for years, and eventually draw the attention of the entire nation. Hetty Robinson produced a second document, a codicil, she claimed, that Sylvia had signed years earlier, promising to leave the entire fortune to her niece alone. If genuine, this paper would override the official will and deliver every penny to Hetty. The executors of the estate examined the codicil with growing suspicion. They declared it a forgery. The signature, they claimed, was not authentic. It had been traced or copied, manufactured by someone who stood to gain enormously from its acceptance. That someone, in their view, was Hetty Robinson herself. What followed was one of the most sensational inheritance trials of the 19th century. The Howland will case, as it came to be known, dragged through the Massachusetts courts for 6 grueling years, consuming enormous legal fees, generating scandalous headlines, and subjecting Hetty to accusations that would shadow her for the rest of her life. Was she a grieving niece defending her rightful inheritance, or a calculating fraud willing to forge documents to seize money that was not hers? The trial introduced America to forensic handwriting analysis on a scale never before attempted in court. The executors hired distinguished experts, including Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. and a professor of mathematics from Harvard named Benjamin Pierce, who used sophisticated probability theory to argue that the signatures on Hetty's codicil were too similar to one another, suspiciously, impossibly similar to have been written naturally at different times. The statistical analysis suggested that the signatures had been traced from a single original, producing identical copies that no honest human hand could have produced independently. Hetty fought back fiercely with her own experts and witnesses. She argued that her aunt had indeed promised her everything. She insisted that the codicil was genuine and that the executors were thieves trying to steal her birthright. The battle consumed 6 years of her life and cost both sides enormous sums in legal fees. In the end, the court ruled against her. The codicil was declared invalid, and Hetty received only the portion specified in the official will, approximately $1 million. Plus income from a trust that would eventually become hers outright. It was still a substantial fortune, more than most Americans could dream of possessing. But it was not everything she believed was rightfully hers, and the public verdict, whispered in drawing rooms and printed in newspapers from Boston to New York, was worse than the legal one. In the eyes of many, Hetty Robinson had been exposed as a forger, a schemer, a woman whose greed knew no bounds. Whether the codicil was genuine remains debated by historians to this day. Some believe Hetty was telling the truth that her aunt had made private promises and put them in writing, only to be betrayed by executors who wanted to distribute the money to other causes. Others believe the document was indeed a fraud, produced by a young woman who felt entitled to every cent of the Howland fortune and was willing to lie to claim it. The truth has been buried with the participants. What is certain is the effect the trial had on Hetty Robinson. She emerged from the courtroom hardened, suspicious, and absolutely convinced that the world was full of people who wanted to take what was hers. She had fought for 6 years against lawyers, executors, and experts who had called her a criminal. She had watched her reputation shredded in newspapers that delighted in the spectacle of a wealthy woman brought low. And she had learned a lesson she would never forget. Trust no one. Guard everything. The moment you let down your defenses, the thieves will come. It was during these turbulent years that Hetty Robinson became Hetty Green, though the transformation would prove to be far more than a change of name. Edward Henry Green was a Vermont businessman who had made his fortune in the Philippines, trading in tea, silk, and other goods across the Pacific. He was tall, charming, and sociable. Everything Hetty was not. Where she was suspicious, he was expansive. Where she hoarded, he spent freely. He enjoyed fine hotels, good company, and the pleasures that money could buy. He moved through the world with an ease and confidence that came naturally to men of means in the 19th century, untroubled by the anxieties that consumed his future wife. His world was one of gentlemen's clubs, warm handshakes, and optimistic ventures, the very opposite of Hetty's guarded calculation. They married on July 11, 1867, shortly after the will case concluded. The timing was significant. Hetty, having just endured years of public humiliation and legal warfare, chose a partner who represented everything she had been denied during the trial: respectability, social acceptance, and a veneer of normalcy. Edward Green offered her something she desperately needed: a shield against the whispers and accusations. A married woman was less vulnerable to scandal than a single heiress fighting in court, and Edward, for his part, was marrying one of the wealthiest women in America. The marriage contract itself revealed the depth of Hetty's distrust. She insisted on keeping her fortune entirely separate from her husband's assets. This was highly unusual for the era, when married women's property typically became their husbands' under the laws of coverture. Hetty demanded ironclad protections, consulting lawyers and refusing to proceed until the documents were unassailable. Her money would remain her money. Her investments would remain her investments. If the marriage failed, or if Edward proved less trustworthy than he appeared, she would not lose a single dollar. Edward agreed to these terms, and for a time, the marriage functioned reasonably well. They had 2 children: Edward Howland Robinson Green, called Ned, born in 1868, and Harriet Sylvia Ann Howland Green, called Sylvia, born in 1871. The family moved between New York, Vermont, and eventually London, where Edward pursued business interests and Hetty continued to manage her growing portfolio with obsessive attention, scrutinizing every investment and questioning every expense. But the tensions that would define the marriage were present from the start. Edward believed that money was meant to be enjoyed. He liked comfort, society, and the visible markers of success. Hetty believed that money was meant to be preserved, accumulated, invested, and protected against the inevitable disasters that the world would throw at it. He wanted to expand, she wanted to defend. He spent freely while she saved relentlessly. The collision between these opposing philosophies was slow but relentless. Edward's own business ventures did not always prosper and often failed entirely. He speculated freely in ventures that promised much and delivered little. He borrowed carelessly against future profits that never materialized. And eventually, his debts began to mount, substantial debts that threatened to entangle Hetty's carefully protected fortune. The marriage that had begun as a partnership, or at least a workable truce, gradually became a source of bitter conflict. Hetty found herself defending her wealth not only against outside threats, but against her own husband's reckless appetites and endless optimism. By the time the family returned permanently to America in the 1870s, the patterns of their strange marriage were firmly set. Hetty would manage the money with iron control. Edward would be kept at arm's length from all serious financial decisions. The children would grow up in the shadow of their mother's obsession and their father's mounting frustration. And Hetty herself, having survived both the will case and the many strains of marriage, would turn her full attention to the arena where she truly belonged. Wall Street was waiting. The financial markets of Gilded Age America were a battlefield, chaotic, ruthless, and dominated by men who believed women had no place among them. They were about to meet a woman who disagreed entirely. Armed with her inheritance, her hard-won lessons in distrust, and a formidable mind that had been trained since childhood to track every penny, Hetty Green was ready to become something the world had never quite seen before, a female titan of finance. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a financial district in the moments before total panic. The newsboys stop shouting, the clerks pause at their desks, men glance at one another with sudden, animal fear, and then, all at once, the storm breaks, crowds surging toward bank doors, the terrible sound of fortunes evaporating and the time it takes to draw breath. The great financial panics of the Gilded Age arrive like hurricanes, destroying careers and families and institutions that had seemed eternal only hours before. Fortunes built over decades vanished in days. Banks that had stood for generations shuttered their windows and posted guards at their doors. Proud men found themselves ruined, their names added to the long list of those who had trusted the wrong partners, invested in the wrong ventures, held on too long or sold too soon. And somewhere, always, standing apart from the chaos, Hetty Green was watching not with fear, but with the cold, calculating patience of a predator waiting for the herd to scatter. She understood something that most investors, then and now, struggle to accept. Panic creates opportunity. When crowds rush for the exits, prices collapse far below true value. When banks fail and credit freezes, those with ready cash become kings. The secret to Hetty Green's fortune was not brilliant speculation or insider knowledge. It was liquidity, patience, and the absolute refusal to follow the crowd. While other investors borrowed heavily to chase rising markets, Hetty kept vast reserves of cash readily available. While others panicked and sold at the bottom, she waited quietly, her black dress unchanged, her expression unreadable, her checkbook ready. She had learned from the whaling merchants of New Bedford that the greatest profits came not from the obvious opportunities but from the desperate moments when others lost their nerve. The first great test of this strategy came during the Panic of 1873. The collapse began in September with the failure of J. Cook & Company, one of the most respected banking houses in America. Cook had made his reputation financing the Union during the Civil War, selling government bonds with such success that he had come to be called the financier of the Northern cause. But peace had led him into different ventures. He had overextended himself financing the Northern Pacific Railroad, and when the bonds could not be sold fast enough to meet obligations, the firm imploded. The news sent shockwaves through the financial world. If J. Cook could fail, anyone could fail. Banks across the country began to totter. The New York Stock Exchange closed for 10 days, an unprecedented shutdown signaling the depth of the crisis. Businesses failed by the thousands. Breadlines formed in cities that had seemed prosperous only months before. Hetty Green was 38 years old when the panic struck, still relatively new to the world of high finance, but already possessed of substantial capital from her inheritance and early returns on her investments. Where others saw disaster, she saw a clearance sale. Railroad bonds that had traded at par could now be purchased for 30 or 40 cents on the dollar. Mortgages on valuable properties could be acquired from desperate sellers at enormous discounts. Real estate that had seemed overpriced suddenly became a bargain as owners scrambled to raise cash by any means necessary. She moved methodically through the wreckage, buying assets that terrified other investors, confident that the country would eventually recover, and her bargains would multiply in value. This pattern would repeat itself throughout her career. The Panic of 1893 found her similarly positioned, cash-rich and predatory, while the rest of the financial world scrambled for survival. This crisis was even more severe than its predecessor, triggered by the collapse of the Reading Railroad and the subsequent failure of hundreds of banks and thousands of businesses. The crisis was rooted in overbuilding, speculation, and a shaky monetary system that could not withstand the pressures placed upon it. Unemployment reached levels not seen before in American history. Desperate men marched on Washington demanding relief. The gold standard itself seemed threatened as foreign investors fled American securities. And Hetty Green, once again, went shopping. She bought railroad bonds from panic sellers who needed cash immediately and would accept any price. She purchased mortgages on properties whose owners could no longer make payments. She lent money at rates that reflected the desperation of borrowers and the scarcity of available credit. When borrowers came begging for extensions and easier terms, she listened carefully and then made decisions based on pure calculation, not sympathy. Her methods were not gentle. She drove hard bargains and showed no sympathy for those on the other side of the table. But her methods were legal, and they were devastatingly effective. The Panic of 1907 provided perhaps her most dramatic demonstration of financial power. This crisis threatened to bring down the entire American banking system. The trouble began with a failed attempt to corner the market in copper stock, which led to runs on banks associated with the speculators. Trust companies failed in rapid succession, their depositors forming long lines in the streets, desperate to withdraw savings before the vaults emptied. The stock market collapsed. Even J.P. Morgan, the titan of Wall Street, worked frantically to organize rescue operations and prevent complete catastrophe. It was said that Morgan personally summoned the leading bankers of New York to his library, locked the doors, and refused to release them until they agreed to pool their resources. Hetty Green did not attend that meeting. She did not need Morgan's help, and she did not require his protection. Her position was fundamentally different from nearly every other major investor in the country. She had no debts. She had no leverage positions that could be called in by nervous lenders. She had nothing but cash, bonds, and the deeds to properties that would retain their value regardless of what happened to the stock market. When banks tottered on the edge of collapse, she reportedly offered to lend money to the city of New York itself, helping to stabilize municipal finances during the worst days of the crisis. The exact terms and amounts remained disputed, but the symbolism was unmistakable. A woman in a shabby black dress had become one of the most important sources of liquidity in the American financial system. Her investment strategy, examined closely, was remarkably conservative by the standards of the Gilded Age. She avoided the speculative manias that regularly swept through Wall Street, the railroad bubbles, the mining crazes, the real estate booms that promised instant riches and frequently delivered ruin. Instead, she focused on assets that produced steady income and could be understood without elaborate financial analysis. Railroad bonds were a favorite, particularly those secured by real property and physical assets that would retain value even if the operating company failed. Municipal bonds offered similar security, backed by the taxing power of cities and states that would continue to exist regardless of economic conditions. Real estate, especially in growing cities like Chicago and New York, provided rental income and long-term appreciation. She owned mortgages on properties across the country, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, and collected payments with relentless efficiency. When borrowers defaulted, she foreclosed without hesitation, adding the underlying properties to her growing portfolio. She owned entire city blocks in Chicago, substantial holdings in St. Lonnie, Louis, and properties scattered across Texas, where her son would eventually establish his own eccentric empire. The scale of her real estate operations was staggering, requiring constant attention to leases, taxes, and tenant disputes. She managed them with the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized everything she did. The physical circumstances of her business operations formed a stark contrast to the grandeur of her male contemporaries. While Morgan conducted business from a palatial office filled with Renaissance art and rare manuscripts, while the Vanderbilts surrounded themselves with marble and mahogany, Hetty Green worked from borrowed desks in the vault rooms of banks. She chose these locations partly for security. Her securities and documents were literally locked in the vault beside her, and partly for economy. The banks provided heat, light, and respectability without charging rent. She sat on hard wooden chairs, surrounded by stacks of bonds tied with ordinary string, wearing the same black dress she had worn for years. There were no secretaries, no assistants, no paid staff to manage her affairs. She did everything herself, trusting no one with the details of her empire. The image was calculated, at least in part. Hetty understood that her shabby appearance unnerved opponents and gave her psychological advantage in negotiations. Men who expected a woman to be vain and easily flattered found themselves facing someone utterly indifferent to their opinions. Her reputation for ruthlessness preceded her into every meeting. Those who underestimated her learned quickly that the dowdy exterior concealed a mind as sharp as any on Wall Street. But the image was also genuine. She truly did not care about comfort or display. The money she accumulated was not, in her mind, meant to be spent on herself. It was meant to grow, to compound, to become ever larger and more secure. Every dollar spent on luxury was a dollar that could not earn interest. Every indulgence was a betrayal of the principles that had made her fortune possible. Her male contemporaries built palaces and bought yachts and competed to outspend one another in displays of conspicuous wealth. Hetty Green accumulated and preserved, growing richer with each passing year while living like a woman of modest means. This paradox, the compulsive accumulation combined with the absolute refusal to enjoy, lies at the heart of her strange story. She had built one of the great fortunes of American history through discipline, patience, and an almost supernatural ability to remain calm while others panicked. She had proven herself the equal of any man on Wall Street, and yet she lived in boarding houses, wore threadbare clothes, and counted pennies with the anxiety of someone perpetually on the verge of poverty. Why? What drove this relentless, joyless accumulation? The answers lie not in the counting houses of Wall Street, but in the darker corners of Hetty Green's domestic life, in the strange household she created, the children she raised in the shadow of her obsession, and the personal costs that her financial genius ultimately exacted. A fortune without a mansion. The house she never built in the spring of 1882, while Caroline Schermerhorn Astor was perfecting the guest list for her legendary ball, 400 guests. Representing the absolute pinnacle of New York society, Hetty Green was negotiating rent on a cold water flat in Hoboken, New Jersey. The contrast could hardly be more complete, misses the point. Astor's ballroom at 350 Fifth Avenue would blaze with gaslight reflected in mirrors and diamonds, hosting the families whose names defined American aristocracy. Hetty Green's flat would have bare walls, minimal furniture, and whatever heating she could avoid paying for. Both women were fabulously wealthy. Both were powerful in their own domains. But where Mrs. Astor built monuments to her status, mansions, ballrooms, summer cottages in Newport, Hetty Green built nothing at all. This was perhaps the strangest aspect of her strange life. In an age when wealth demanded architectural expression, when the newly rich and the established aristocracy alike competed to build ever more elaborate homes, Hetty Green refused to participate. She owned no Fifth Avenue palace. She commissioned no Newport cottage. She built no country estate with rolling lawns and imported statuary. While her fortune grew to rival those of the Vanderbilts and Astors, her living circumstances remained resolutely modest. A series of rented rooms and boarding houses and apartments scattered across New York and New Jersey, chosen not for comfort or prestige but for economy and anonymity. The Gilded Age was, above all else, an era of architectural ambition. The great fortunes of the period expressed themselves through stone and mortar, through mansions that announced their owner's arrival at the summit of American society. The Vanderbilts led the way, building palaces along Fifth Avenue that rivaled anything in Europe. William Kissam Vanderbilt's chateau at 660 Fifth Avenue, completed in 1882, cost approximately $3 million and introduced French Renaissance architecture to the American plutocracy. The interiors glittered with imported marble, hand-carved woodwork, and stained glass commissioned from the finest European craftsmen. His brother Cornelius II built an even larger mansion at 742 Fifth Avenue, with over 130 rooms and a ballroom that could accommodate hundreds of guests. Down in Asheville, North Carolina, George Washington Vanderbilt was planning Biltmore, a 175,000-square-foot chateau that would become the largest private residence in American history. Other families followed the pattern with equal enthusiasm. The Astors built and rebuilt their holdings along Fifth Avenue, each generation adding to the architectural legacy. J.P. Morgan's brownstone library, stuffed with Renaissance masterpieces and rare manuscripts, became a temple to culture and power. Andrew Carnegie's mansion at 2 East 91st Street signaled his arrival among the elite, while also housing his progressive ideals about philanthropy and education. Even those with lesser fortunes built impressive homes, each one a statement of identity, a claim to permanence, a monument that would outlast its creator and remind future generations of the family's importance. Hetty Green wanted absolutely none of it. Her reasons were partly financial, though not in the way one might expect. Building a mansion would not have strained her resources. She could have afforded any palace on Fifth Avenue and still had more money than she could spend in a dozen lifetimes. The expense she feared was not the construction itself, but the endless drain that ownership implied. A mansion required servants, dozens of them, in the case of the largest homes, who had to be paid, housed, fed, and supervised. It required maintenance, heating costs that could reach thousands of dollars per winter, repairs to roofs and plumbing and elaborate facades, groundskeepers and gardeners and specialists of every description. It required furnishings, artwork, carriages, horses, and all the other accoutrements of elite life. And it required visibility, a fixed address where creditors, lawyers, and tax assessors could always find you. To Hetty Green, a mansion was not a symbol of success. It was a liability disguised as luxury, a drain on resources that might otherwise compound in her account books. Hetty preferred to be invisible, her peripatetic lifestyle moving frequently between boarding houses in Hoboken, Brooklyn, and Manhattan. Never staying anywhere long enough to establish permanent residence was partly a strategy to avoid taxation. New Jersey had no income tax, making it attractive for a woman whose annual income from investments might reach several $100,000. New York, by contrast, was eager to tax wealthy residents on their full holdings. By maintaining ambiguous residency and moving constantly, Hetty created uncertainty about where she officially lived and thus what taxes she legally owed. Tax collectors could not pin her down. Courts struggled to establish jurisdiction. The savings were substantial, and the strategy was perfectly legal, if morally questionable, to those who believed that great wealth carried civic obligations. But tax avoidance alone does not explain her choices. Something deeper was at work. Hetty Green seemed genuinely indifferent to physical comfort, to the pleasures that architecture could provide, to the social status that a grand home would have conferred. She did not want to entertain society. She did not want to display her wealth. She did not want the responsibilities that came with maintaining an establishment. Her home, such as it was, existed entirely in portable form, stacks of bonds and securities that she carried in battered bags, ledgers, and account books that recorded her true estate. Documents representing ownership of properties scattered across the country that she would never personally visit. The logistics of her daily life reflected this philosophy completely. She negotiated rent aggressively, haggling over every dollar with landlords who often had no idea of her true wealth. She avoided heating costs by wearing heavy clothes indoors and spending her days in bank vaults where the heat was free. She carried her own ledgers and documents rather than trusting them to assistants or storage facilities. She ate cheap meals in modest restaurants, sometimes carrying sandwiches in her bag to avoid paying even modest prices. She owned few possessions that could not be moved quickly and quietly to a new location when circumstances demanded. Her world was paper and numbers, not brick and marble. Contemporary accounts describe her arriving at the Chemical National Bank in Manhattan, where she conducted much of her business, dressed in shabby black and carrying bags stuffed with securities. She would settle at her customary desk in the vault room, spreading papers around her, working through columns of figures with the same concentration she had shown as a child in her grandfather's counting house. The contrast with the magnificent offices of her male contemporaries could not have been starker. While they surrounded themselves with the visible signs of success, mahogany desks, leather chairs, paintings and sculptures that testified to their cultivation, she sat amid bare walls and metal filing cabinets, interested only in the numbers. There is something both admirable and disturbing in this absolute rejection of display. On one hand, Hetty Green's indifference to material show represented a kind of purity. She was not deceived by the illusions of permanence that architecture creates. She knew that fortunes could disappear, that mansions could be lost to creditors or destroyed by fire, that the elaborate structures her contemporaries were building would eventually crumble or pass to strangers. Many of the great Gilded Age homes would indeed be demolished within decades, their grandeur erased by changing tastes and economic pressures. Her wealth existed in portable liquid-form bonds that could be sold, mortgages that produced income, shares that could be transferred with a signature. She was never trapped by possessions, never anchored to a single location, never dependent on servants or systems that might fail. On the other hand, her refusal to build was also a refusal to participate, to contribute, to leave any mark on the physical world. The great mansions of the Gilded Age, for all their excess, were also achievements, works of art, that employed thousands of craftsmen, that preserved European traditions and created new American ones, that would eventually become museums and schools and monuments to a vanished era. Hetty Green created nothing visible. She left no architectural legacy, no physical evidence of her passage through the world. Her fortune, the careful work of a lifetime, existed only on paper. When she died, there was no ancestral home to pass to her children. There was no estate where family portraits hung in oak-paneled halls, where Christmas gatherings would bring generations together, where the name of Green would be inscribed in stone above a grand entrance. There was only money, vast amounts of it to be sure, but money without a physical form, without a setting, without the permanence that architecture provides. Her children would inherit millions of dollars, but no family seat, no tangible connection to their mother's life beyond the ledgers, the account books, and securities she had so carefully accumulated. The contrast with other Gilded Age fortunes could not be more complete. Visitors to the Biltmore estate today can walk through rooms where the Vanderbilts entertained their guests, can admire the library and banquet hall and gardens, can feel some connection to a vanished world. Visitors to Newport can tour the cottages where the 400 summered, can imagine the balls and dinners and elaborate social rituals. These homes have become monuments, preserving the memory of their builders long after the fortunes themselves have dispersed. Hetty Green left no such monument. She passed through the world accumulating wealth but refusing to give it permanent form. Her estate was invisible, intangible, a fortune that existed entirely in the abstract realm of finance rather than the physical world of architecture and art. In choosing to build nothing, she declared that wealth was not about display or permanence or legacy. It was about power, security, and the cold satisfaction of watching numbers grow. She needed no mansion to prove her importance. The numbers themselves were enough. But even the most portable fortune cannot be carried into the grave. And the question that haunted Hetty Green's final years was what would happen to the wealth she had accumulated so obsessively, what her children would do with the inheritance she had spent a lifetime building and protecting, and whether they would preserve what she had created or scatter it to the winds. What does it mean to be the child of one of the richest people in America and to grow up cold-patched and perpetually aware that every penny spent on your comfort was a penny your mother considered wasted? Edward Howland Robinson Green and Harriet Sylvia Ann Howland Green knew the answer to that question intimately. They were heirs to a fortune that would have placed them among the most privileged children on earth. Instead, they grew up in the shadow of their mother's obsession, caught between the reality of vast wealth and the daily experience of pinching, scraping, and doing without. The inheritance that awaited them was staggering. The childhood that preceded it was something else entirely. Ned Green was born in London on August 22, 1868, during one of the family's extended stays abroad. His father, Edward Henry Green, was pursuing business interests in England, and his mother was, as always, managing her investments with meticulous attention from whatever rented room she currently occupied. From his earliest years, Ned experienced the peculiar contradiction that would define his childhood. His family was wealthy beyond imagination, but their daily life resembled that of struggling clerks. The apartments were modest, the meals were plain, the clothes were worn until they could be worn no longer and then patched rather than replaced. Servants were few and frequently dismissed for demanding wages that Hetty considered excessive. His sister Sylvia arrived 3 years later, on January 7, 1871. Where Ned would grow into a large, gregarious man with appetites to match, Sylvia remained quieter, more reserved, shaped by the same circumstances but responding to them differently. Both children learned early that their mother's love was conditional not on behavior or achievement, but on their acceptance of her worldview. To question her frugality was to invite her wrath. To suggest that perhaps they might enjoy some small comfort that money could easily provide was to demonstrate dangerous weakness of character. Hetty believed she was teaching them survival. She believed the world was full of people eager to separate them from their inheritance. She believed that comfort bred complacency and complacency bred ruin. The lessons were relentless. When the family lived in Vermont during portions of the children's youth, the house was heated minimally even in the harsh New England winters. Hetty saw no reason to burn fuel merely for comfort when extra blankets would serve. The children wore clothes that their peers would have rejected, not merely unfashionable, but visibly mended, obviously second-hand, chosen for durability rather than appearance. They attended local schools rather than the prestigious academies where other wealthy children received their education. They were kept apart from the social world of the elite, denied the friendships and connections that might have integrated them into their own class. Hetty feared that such connections would encourage spending, would teach her children to value display over substance, would ultimately lead them to squander everything she had built. The most infamous story of Hetty's parental neglect involves Ned's leg. The tale has been told countless times, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until separating fact from legend becomes genuinely difficult. What is documented is this: sometime during his childhood, Ned injured his leg. The circumstances vary in different accounts, with some versions citing a sledding accident and others mentioning a fall or other mishap. The injury became infected or otherwise complicated, requiring medical attention. What happened next became the centerpiece of the Hetty Green mythology. According to the popular legend, Hetty refused to pay for proper medical care. She supposedly dressed herself and her son in rags and took him to charity clinics, pretending to be impoverished so that she could receive free treatment. When doctors at one such clinic recognized her and demanded payment, she allegedly stormed out rather than spend the money. The infection worsened over years of neglect and inadequate care, until finally the leg had to be amputated below the knee. Ned would wear a prosthetic cork leg for the rest of his life, a permanent physical reminder of his mother's pathological cheapness. The truth is more complicated and less clear-cut than the legend suggests. Medical records from the period are incomplete, and the accounts that survive were often written by journalists hostile to Hetty or by family members with their own reasons for shaping the narrative. What seems likely is that Hetty did seek out inexpensive treatment, that she was reluctant to pay specialist fees when she believed competent care could be obtained more cheaply, and that the medical limitations of the era contributed significantly to the eventual outcome. 19th century medicine could do little for serious bone infections. Antibiotics did not exist. Even wealthy patients with access to the best physicians often lost limbs to conditions that modern medicine would cure easily. Whether Hetty's frugality made a decisive difference, or whether Ned would have lost his leg regardless, cannot be determined with certainty. What is certain is the psychological impact. Ned grew up knowing that his mother had refused or at least delayed treatment that might have saved his leg. He grew up knowing that her love for money competed with and perhaps exceeded her love for her children. He wore the evidence of that competition every day for the rest of his life, strapping on a cork leg each morning before he could walk. The experience might have turned him bitter, might have driven him to reject his mother entirely. Instead, it seemed to plant something different, a determination to enjoy life, to spend freely, to experience every pleasure that money could buy, pleasures his mother had denied him throughout his childhood. If she would not let him use the family fortune, he would wait until it was his and use it spectacularly. Sylvia's response to their shared upbringing was notably different. Where Ned grew expansive and indulgent, Sylvia became cautious and withdrawn. She never fully escaped the shadow of her mother's parsimony, never developed her brother's appetite for display and pleasure. She remained closer to Hetty throughout her life, more obedient to her mother's vision of how wealth should be handled. She married Matthew Astor Wilkes in 1909, a match that connected her to one of America's oldest aristocratic families. Though the Wilkes branch was not among the wealthiest Astors, the marriage was quiet, the life that followed unremarkable. Sylvia inherited her mother's caution without inheriting her mother's genius for accumulation. She preserved her wealth but did not multiply it. She lived comfortably but not lavishly. She left no dramatic stories for biographers to recount. The divergence between the two siblings offers a psychological study in how children respond to extreme parental control. Ned rebelled by becoming everything his mother was not: generous, indulgent, eager to spend and enjoy and experience. Sylvia submitted, internalizing her mother's values even while perhaps resenting the deprivations of her childhood. Both responses were shaped by the same crucible: the cold rooms, the patched clothes, the constant awareness of money as the central fact of existence. But they emerged transformed in opposite directions. During their childhood and young adulthood, both Ned and Sylvia remained largely under their mother's control. Hetty managed their inheritances from their father's side of the family with the same iron grip she applied to her own fortune. When Edward Henry Green died in 1902, whatever remained of his estate passed to his children. But Hetty maintained authority over their financial decisions. She had trained them to be dependent on her judgment, had kept them isolated from the social connections that might have given them independent perspectives, had made herself indispensable to their understanding of how money worked. They were wealthy in theory but constrained in practice, heirs waiting for their inheritance to actually arrive. Ned found ways to assert himself despite these constraints. He developed interests that his mother considered foolish but could not entirely suppress. He was fascinated by technology, by speed, by the mechanical innovations that were transforming American life. Automobiles captivated him particularly, those expensive, unreliable, thrilling machines that represented everything Hetty despised about modern extravagance. He acquired cars despite her disapproval, though he had to maintain them carefully and avoid drawing her attention to the expense. He developed friendships and romantic attachments that she considered unsuitable. He chafed against her control even while remaining financially dependent on her cooperation. His physical limitation did not prevent him from living actively. The prosthetic leg was a constant presence, but Ned refused to let it define him as an invalid. He walked, traveled, pursued his interests with energy that belied any suggestion of disability. If anything, the cork legs seemed to fuel his determination to live fully, as if he were determined to extract from life every pleasure his mother had denied him, to prove that her calculations about what was necessary and what was wasteful were wrong. Sylvia, meanwhile, followed a more conventional path. She remained closer to her mother, both geographically and emotionally. She learned to manage money carefully, though without her mother's aggressive investment strategies. She avoided scandal and public attention. When she married Matthew Wilkes, it was a respectable union that attracted modest newspaper coverage and then faded from public interest. She became what her mother had perhaps always wanted her to be, a quiet steward of wealth, neither flamboyant nor incompetent, simply preserving what had been accumulated. The contrast between the siblings would become even more pronounced after Hetty's death. Freed from his mother's supervision, Ned would embark on spending sprees that would have horrified her. He would collect automobiles by the dozen, yachts by the fleet, mistresses with apparent enthusiasm. He would build what she had refused to build, an elaborate estate in Texas, filled with expensive curiosities and maintained by armies of servants. He would become, in his way, a Gilded Age figure himself, not a captain of industry, but a prince of consumption, determined to enjoy every dollar his mother had so painfully accumulated. Sylvia would continue as she had always been, careful, modest, largely invisible. Her fortune would grow slowly through conservative management. Her lifestyle would remain comfortable but unremarkable. She would outlive her brother by several decades and die as she had lived quietly, without drama, leaving behind wealth but few stories. Together, the two children represented the full range of responses to Hetty Green's extraordinary parenting. One rebelled extravagantly, one conformed dutifully. Neither escaped entirely unchanged. The fortune their mother built would shape their lives completely, just as it had shaped hers, though the shapes it produced could hardly have been more different. But before either child could fully claim their inheritance, Hetty Green had to finish her own story. And in her final years, as her health declined and her grip on daily affairs weakened, questions began to emerge about what would happen to the empire she had built. Would her children honor her principles? Would the fortune survive intact? Or would everything she had accumulated so carefully be scattered by heirs who had never shared her obsession with preservation? The answers lay just ahead, in the transfer of wealth from one generation to the next. The break in the pattern. Colonel Ned Green and the Texas estate. The telegram announcing Hetty Green's death reached her son on July 3, 1916. Within months, Edward Howland Robinson Green, now Colonel Green, a title bestowed by the Texas state legislature in recognition of his business interests there, began spending money at a pace that would have stopped his mother's heart had it still been beating. The transformation was immediate, deliberate, and almost theatrical in its excess. For 50 years, Ned Green had lived under his mother's iron control, watching her accumulate wealth while denying herself and her children even modest pleasures. Now, suddenly, he was free, and he intended to use that freedom spectacularly. His inheritance was vast. Estimates placed his share of the estate at approximately $100 million, half of everything Hetty had accumulated over her extraordinary career. In modern terms, this represented well over $1 billion, a fortune capable of funding any ambition, any indulgence, any whim that crossed his mind. Ned had spent decades watching that fortune grow while wearing patched clothes and living in rented rooms. He had lost his leg, perhaps because his mother would not pay for proper treatment. He had endured her lectures about waste, her suspicion of pleasure, her relentless focus on accumulation over enjoyment. Now, the accumulation was complete. The enjoyment could begin. Texas became the canvas for his transformation. Ned had developed business interests in the state during his mother's lifetime, investing in railroads and developing connections that earned him the honorary colonelcy he treasured. After her death, he expanded his Texas holdings dramatically, acquiring land and building an estate that stood as the absolute negation of everything Hetty had represented. Where she had rented cramped rooms in anonymous boarding houses, he built sprawling grounds. Where she had avoided servants, he employed dozens. Where she had carried her securities in battered bags, he constructed facilities to house his ever-growing collections. The property itself became a monument to released wealth. The main house was substantial but not architecturally distinguished. Ned cared more about function than classical proportions. What mattered were the outbuildings, the infrastructure, the elaborate systems that supported his varied interests. There were laboratories equipped with the latest scientific apparatus. There were workshops where mechanics maintained his growing fleet of automobiles. There were stables, though Ned's passion for horses was modest compared to his enthusiasm for machines. There were quarters for the staff required to maintain such an establishment: gardeners, drivers, cooks, maids, groundskeepers, and specialists of every description. The payroll alone would have horrified Hetty, who had begrudged every dollar spent on hired help. But the Texas estate was only part of Ned's expanding empire of consumption. He also maintained Round Hill, a magnificent property in South Dartmouth, Massachusetts, that became his primary residence and the center of his most elaborate experiments. Round Hill sat on nearly 200 acres overlooking Buzzards Bay, featuring a mansion, extensive grounds, and facilities that Ned continuously expanded to accommodate his interests. The Massachusetts property became famous for its radio installations, its laboratories, and the parade of scientists, inventors, and curious visitors who passed through its gates. Radio fascinated Ned completely. Wireless communication was still a relatively new technology in the years following the First World War, and Ned threw himself into it with the enthusiasm of a man making up for lost time. He built transmission towers on his properties, acquired the latest equipment, and corresponded with researchers working at the frontier of the field. His station, with the call sign WMAF, became one of the most powerful amateur radio installations in the country. He broadcast programs, conducted experiments, and accumulated radio equipment with the same compulsive energy his mother had directed toward bonds and mortgages. The irony was perfect. Hetty had built her fortune on the slow, patient accumulation of interest-bearing securities, while her son poured money into technologies that might or might not succeed. Driven by curiosity rather than calculation, his collections grew to staggering proportions. Ned collected coins with an obsession that rivaled anything in his mother's psychological makeup, though directed toward acquisition rather than preservation. His numismatic holdings became legendary, including rare specimens that dealers and museums coveted. He collected stamps with similar enthusiasm, building one of the finest philatelic collections in private hands. He collected automobiles, not merely a few prized vehicles, but fleets of them, stored in specially constructed garages and maintained by full-time mechanics. He collected yachts, keeping multiple vessels ready for his use. He collected firearms, jewelry, pornography, and curiosities of every description. The son of a woman who had owned perhaps one dress at a time accumulated possessions on a scale that bordered on mania. The staff required to maintain this lifestyle represented an ongoing expense that would have made Hetty physically ill. At Round Hill alone, dozens of employees worked year-round to keep the estate functioning. Groundskeepers maintained the gardens and lawns. Mechanics serviced the automobiles. Servants cleaned and cooked and attended to the endless details of running a great household. Radio technicians operated and maintained the elaborate broadcasting equipment. Security personnel guarded the collections and the property. The annual payroll ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars, a sum that Hetty would have considered sufficient to live on for multiple lifetimes. Ned's hospitality extended his mother's fortune in directions she would have found incomprehensible. He entertained lavishly, hosting parties and gatherings that brought visitors from across the country. Scientists came to use his laboratories and discuss the latest developments in radio technology. Collectors came to admire his coins and stamps. Politicians and businessmen came to enjoy his hospitality and perhaps to seek his favor. Where Hetty had avoided company, suspicious of anyone who might want something from her, Ned welcomed guests enthusiastically. The lonely, isolated childhood had left him hungry for connection, for society, for the warmth of human company that his mother had denied him. His personal life reflected the same pattern of delayed gratification finally released. Ned had a common-law wife, Mabel Harlow, who had been his companion for years and who now presided over his establishments as hostess and partner. Their relationship had scandalized respectable society during Hetty's lifetime. The old woman had reportedly disapproved intensely, but after her death, Ned and Mabel lived openly together, entertaining guests and managing their peculiar household without apparent concern for conventional opinion. Mabel shared Ned's enthusiasm for spending, and together they transformed the accumulated capital of generations into an ongoing festival of consumption. The contrast with his mother's life could not have been more complete or more deliberately constructed. Every element of Ned's existence seemed designed to repudiate Hetty's principles. She had rented, he owned. She had avoided heat, he maintained vast properties regardless of cost. She had worn the same black dress for years. He accumulated wardrobes and collections and possessions without limit. She had trusted no one. He surrounded himself with employees, guests, and companions. She had made money her purpose. He made spending his pleasure. The cork leg he strapped on each morning remained a permanent reminder of what her frugality had cost him. And perhaps every dollar he spent was a small act of revenge. Whether this represented freedom, rebellion, or something more complicated remains difficult to assess. Ned clearly enjoyed his wealth in ways his mother never had. He pursued genuine interests. The radio experiments were not mere indulgence but reflected real curiosity about emerging technology. His collections, however excessive, demonstrated knowledge and discrimination. His hospitality created connections and friendships that enriched his life. In these respects, he achieved something his mother had never managed. He converted money into happiness, or at least into pleasure. But there were shadows in Ned's liberation as well. His spending, though vast, did not exhaust his inheritance. The fortune was simply too large to dissipate entirely in a single lifetime. But it did establish patterns that would not survive him. The collections he assembled would be scattered after his death, sold at auction to pay debts and settle claims. The estates he maintained would pass out of the family. The employees he supported would find themselves seeking work elsewhere. Unlike his mother, who had built something that could be passed on, Ned consumed without creating. He spent the principal rather than living on the interest. He enjoyed the fortune rather than preserving it. His health, compromised by the prosthetic leg and by years of indulgence, declined steadily through the 1930s. The man who had once walked with determination despite his disability became increasingly sedentary, his weight ballooning, his mobility limited. He died on June 8, 1936, at the age of 67, leaving behind collections that would take years to inventory and dispose of, properties that would eventually be sold, and a reputation as one of the most colorful spenders of his generation. The Texas estate and Round Hill and all the other properties passed into other hands. The coins and stamps were auctioned. The automobiles were sold. The radio equipment was dismantled. Within a few years of Ned's death, little physical evidence remained of his 2 decades of spectacular consumption. The fortune his mother had spent a lifetime building had been transformed into experiences, pleasures, and possessions that could not outlast him. Was this waste? Was this justice? Was this simply the natural pattern of wealth across generations, accumulated by the driven, spent by the liberated, dispersed into the broader economy from which it came? Hetty Green would have seen her son's life as tragedy, as validation of every fear she had ever expressed about what would happen if she relaxed her grip on the family money. Ned himself seems to have seen it differently, as the life he had been denied finally lived, as compensation for a childhood of deprivation, as proof that money existed to be used rather than merely counted. The question of a legacy, what remained of the Green fortune, and what it ultimately meant, would fall to other shoulders. Sylvia Green Wilkes, the quieter sibling, had followed a different path entirely, and the final accounting of what Hetty Green had built, and what her children had done with it, would require examining both branches of the family tree. The newspapers made her a monster. Long before Hetty Green died in that modest boarding house room, journalists had transformed her into something more than human, a creature of legend, a cautionary tale. A figure so grotesque that she ceased to be a real person in the public imagination and became instead a symbol. The Witch of Wall Street. The name stuck because it served purposes beyond mere description. It contained within it everything that late 19th century America found disturbing about wealth, gender, and the transgression of boundaries that were supposed to remain fixed. The press of the Gilded Age was voracious, sensational, and utterly without scruple when it came to figures who captured public fascination. Joseph Pulitzer's New York World and William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal competed ferociously for readers, filling their pages with stories designed to shock, titillate, and outrage. Crime, scandal, disaster, and the private lives of the wealthy provided endless material. Reporters embroidered facts liberally, inventing details when necessary, knowing that accuracy mattered less than impact. Editors understood that readers wanted villains and heroes, not complicated human beings who defied simple categories. And in Hetty Green, they found a villain almost too perfect to be true. A wealthy woman who violated every expectation of how wealthy women should behave. The stories about her multiplied and grew more extreme with each retelling, each journalist adding embellishments to distinguish his account from those that came before. She heated her oatmeal on office radiators to save fuel costs. She wore the same black dress until it fell apart, washing only the hem to extend its life rather than pay for proper cleaning. She moved constantly between cheap boarding houses to avoid taxation and the attention of those who might demand money from her. She refused to pay for hot water, for adequate heating, for the basic comforts that even modest families considered essential to civilized life. She let her son's leg become gangrenous rather than pay a doctor's fee. She haggled over pennies with shopkeepers while her fortune climbed toward $100 million. Each story added to the portrait of a woman so consumed by greed that she had abandoned all recognizable humanity. Some of these stories were true, or at least contained elements of truth. Hetty did live frugally. She did wear unfashionable clothes. She did move frequently and conduct business from bank vaults. She did negotiate aggressively and resist expenses that others might have accepted without question. But the journalistic version stripped away context and complexity, leaving only the grotesque outline. A woman who lived simply because she valued independence and distrusted display became a miser who denied herself the barest necessities. A mother who sought affordable medical care in an era of limited treatment options became a monster who crippled her own child. A shrewd investor who understood that liquidity was power became a dragon hoarding gold in a cave. The distortion was not accidental. Hetty Green threatened something fundamental about how Gilded Age America understood gender, wealth, and social order. Women were supposed to spend money, not make it. They were supposed to display their husband's success through elaborate dress, gracious entertaining, and the management of beautiful homes. They were supposed to be ornamental, supportive, dependent. The wealthiest women in America, Mrs. Astor, Mrs. Vanderbilt, the great hostesses of Newport and Fifth Avenue, fulfilled these expectations magnificently. They built mansions, wore diamonds, threw legendary parties, and competed to demonstrate that their families had arrived at the pinnacle of society. They were praised, envied, emulated. Hetty Green did none of these things. She made her own money rather than spending her husband's. She dressed plainly rather than fashionably. She avoided society rather than seeking its approval. She competed directly with men in the brutal arena of high finance and won. She was, in every way that mattered to the cultural expectations of her time, a transgression. The newspapers punished her accordingly. The word witch was not chosen carelessly. It carried centuries of accumulated meaning. The dangerous woman, the woman who refused her proper place, the woman who possessed powers that men could not control or understand. Witches in folklore were often associated with money and greed, with bargains that cost more than they seemed worth, with the corruption of natural order. By calling Hetty Green a witch, journalists drew on deep reservoirs of misogyny and fear. They made her not merely eccentric but evil, not merely unusual but unnatural. They transformed a woman who had mastered the financial markets into something inhuman and therefore safely dismissible. The contrast with how male financiers were portrayed could not be more stark. J.P. Morgan, whose business methods were at least as ruthless as Hetty's, was depicted as a titan, a captain of industry, a figure of awesome power worthy of respect. John D. Jaya. Rockefeller, who crushed competitors without mercy and built a monopoly that strangled entire industries, was criticized but also grudgingly admired for his success. Andrew Carnegie, who drove wages down and broke strikes with brutal efficiency, was celebrated for his philanthropy and his gospel of wealth. These men were allowed to be complicated, powerful, and generous, ruthless and admirable, feared and respected simultaneously. Hetty Green was allowed to be only one thing, a monster. Her refusal to conform to feminine expectations made her an easy target for mockery and condemnation alike. A woman who built a fortune deserved no credit. She must have cheated somehow, must have been lucky or wicked or both. A woman who lived simply despite her wealth was not admirably modest, she was grotesquely miserly, denying herself and her family basic decency that anyone with means should provide. A woman who fought in court for her inheritance was not defending her legitimate rights. She was grasping, greedy, unwomanly. Every quality that would have been praised in a man's shrewdness, discipline, toughness, independence was twisted into something ugly when displayed by a woman. The coverage shaped public perception so thoroughly that separating the real Hetty Green from the newspaper creation became almost impossible. People who had never met her knew with certainty that she was horrible. The stories circulated so widely that they became established fact, repeated in books and articles for over a century. Modern accounts of her life still often accept the most extreme versions of her frugality without question, treating newspaper anecdotes as documentary evidence. The witch outlived the woman. This is perhaps the strangest aspect of Hetty Green's legacy. She built no mansion to preserve her memory. She endowed no museums or libraries to carry her name into the future. She left no architectural monument, no physical structure that visitors could tour and admire. But she left something more durable, a story. The narrative created by hostile journalists, the Witch of Wall Street, the miserly millionairess, the woman who let her son lose his leg has survived for more than a century. It has outlasted the mansions built by her contemporaries, many of which have been demolished or converted to other purposes. It has outlasted the fortunes accumulated by the Vanderbilts and Astors, which have been divided and dispersed across generations. The myth endures when the reality has faded. There is something deeply ironic in this survival. Hetty Green cared nothing for reputation. She made no effort to court public opinion or soften her image. She seemed genuinely indifferent to what newspapers wrote about her, focused entirely on the accumulation and protection of her fortune. The mansions she refused to build would have been monuments to conventional success, statements that she had arrived and deserved respect. Instead, she left the field to her enemies, allowing journalists to define her story without opposition. The woman who controlled every penny of her fortune exerted no control whatsoever over her legacy. The result is a cautionary tale about the power of narrative. Hetty Green's actual accomplishments were extraordinary. She built one of the largest fortunes in American history through discipline, intelligence, and a contrarian investment strategy that consistently outperformed the market. She survived financial panics that destroyed her competitors. She mastered an arena dominated by men who believed women had no place in it. She proved that wealth could be created and preserved through patience and calculation rather than speculation and display. These achievements deserved recognition and, in a more just world, would have earned her respect. Instead, she became a monster in the public imagination. The newspapers needed villains, and a wealthy woman who defied expectations made a perfect target. The stories they told were more compelling than the truth, more memorable than the complicated reality of a woman shaped by loss, suspicion, and the harsh lessons of a Quaker childhood. The witch outlasted the investor. The caricature outlasted the person. What remains, then, is not what Hetty Green built, but what others built from her. The legend of the Witch of Wall Street is itself a kind of architecture, a structure of stories and assumptions that shapes how we understand wealth, gender, and eccentricity. It teaches us less about Hetty Green herself than about the society that created and sustained the myth. It reveals what Gilded Age America feared about women who refused their assigned roles, about wealth that did not display itself properly, about success that could not be controlled or dismissed. And perhaps that revelation is its own form of legacy, unintended, unwanted, but strangely durable. Hetty Green never built a mansion to stand as testament to her achievements. She left no physical monument for future generations to visit and admire. But the stories about her have outlasted stone. Every fortune exacts a price from those who build it. The question is whether the cost is paid by the builder, by those around them, or by both. Hetty Green accumulated one of the great fortunes in American history, guarded it with fierce determination, and passed it largely intact to her children. By the cold measure of financial success, her life was a triumph, a demonstration that discipline, patience, and contrarian thinking could produce wealth to rival the greatest industrialists of the age. But wealth is not the only measure of a life, and Hetty Green paid prices that no balance sheet could record. Her marriage deteriorated slowly but inexorably. Edward Henry Green had entered the union with his own fortune and his own ambitions, expecting perhaps to find a partner who would support his ventures and share his pleasures. Instead, he found himself married to a woman whose devotion to money eclipsed every other consideration. Hetty's insistence on keeping their finances entirely separate, unusual enough in an era when husbands typically controlled their wives' property, signaled from the beginning that trust would be limited and conditional. She watched his investments with suspicion, questioned his judgment, and resisted any expenditure she considered unnecessary. Edward's business ventures frequently failed. He was an optimist by nature, drawn to opportunities that promised much but delivered little, and his judgment proved less reliable than his wife's. When his speculations collapsed and debts accumulated, Hetty faced a choice between bailing him out and watching him sink. She chose, with characteristic cold calculation, to protect her own assets first. Their finances became increasingly entangled in disputes and negotiations, with Hetty maneuvering to ensure that her husband's failures would not drag down her carefully constructed empire. By the 1870s, the marriage had become more arrangement than partnership. Edward spent increasing time away from the family, pursuing business interests that kept him conveniently distant from his wife's disapproval. When the family lived in London during portions of that decade, they maintained separate establishments. When they returned to America, the separations continued. Edward died in 1902, having spent the final decades of his life at the margins of his wife's attention, tolerated but not valued, necessary for appearances but excluded from the heart of her concerns. What this distance cost Hetty emotionally remains impossible to know. She was not a woman who revealed her inner life to journalists or biographers. Perhaps she genuinely preferred her beloved account books to human companionship. Perhaps the early wounds her distant mother, the brutal will contest, the constant suspicion that everyone wanted to steal from her had left her incapable of the vulnerability that intimacy requires. Or perhaps she simply made a calculation. Relationships were unreliable, money was not. Better to trust what could be counted than what could be felt. Her children paid different prices. Ned and Sylvia grew up with every material need theoretically provided for. They would never face genuine poverty, but they experienced deprivation nonetheless. The cold rooms, the patched clothes, the social isolation, the constant awareness that their mother valued money above comfort created psychological wounds that shaped their adult lives. Ned responded by rebelling, by spending lavishly the moment he was free to do so, as if trying to compensate for everything he had been denied. Sylvia responded by conforming, internalizing her mother's caution so thoroughly that she seemed unable to imagine any other way of living. Neither child developed the balanced relationship with money that might have allowed them to enjoy wealth without being consumed by it. Ned's spectacular spending after his mother's death was not the behavior of a man at peace with his inheritance. It was the desperate indulgence of someone trying to fill a void. Sylvia's quiet preservation was not contentment. It was the continuation of patterns learned in childhood, the inability to break free from her mother's shadow. Both children were damaged by the household that formed them, not by poverty, which they never experienced, but by the peculiar cruelty of deprivation amid abundance. The social isolation that Hetty's lifestyle imposed carried its own costs. The wealthy families of Gilded Age America operated within intricate networks of connection and obligation. Marriages were arranged to cement alliances. Business partnerships emerged from social relationships. Information about opportunities, about threats, about the changing currents of finance and politics flowed through ballrooms and dinner parties as well as through counting houses. By refusing to participate in this world, Hetty cut herself off from resources that might have been valuable even by her own narrow standards. She also denied her children access to the social infrastructure that might have supported them. Ned and Sylvia grew up without the friendships, the connections, the easy familiarity with their own class that other wealthy children absorbed naturally. When they entered adulthood, they lacked the networks that smooth paths and open doors. Ned's eventual marriage to Mabel Harlow, a relationship that scandalized respectable society, might have unfolded differently had he been integrated into the world of eligible matches and suitable partners. Sylvia's relatively late marriage to Matthew Wilkes suggested similar difficulties in finding her place. The public ridicule that Hetty endured was another cost, though one she seemed to bear with indifference. The newspaper stories, the Witch of Wall Street nickname, the endless mockery of her clothes and habits, these would have devastated most people. They would have driven any normal person to modify their behavior, to soften their image, to seek some accommodation with public sentiment. Hetty appeared immune, focused so completely on her financial objectives that public opinion simply did not register as important. But indifference is itself a kind of damage. A life lived without regard for human connection, without any concern for how one is perceived or remembered, is a life missing something essential. Whether Hetty felt this absence or it simply armored herself so thoroughly that she no longer noticed remains unknown. There is a broader lesson here, one that extends beyond Hetty Green's particular circumstances to illuminate something about wealth and society in general. The Gilded Age expected the rich to display their riches not merely for vanity, but as a form of social participation. The mansions and parties and charitable donations were expressions of membership in a community, acknowledgments that great wealth carried obligations beyond mere accumulation. By building, by entertaining, by giving, the wealthy demonstrated that they understood themselves as part of something larger than their own bank accounts. Hetty Green refused this bargain entirely. She accumulated without building, profited without sharing, grew richer without becoming a visible part of the communities that made her wealth possible. Her liquidity strategy brilliant in the financial markets, where cash reserves allowed her to buy when others sold, became something darker in her personal life. She remained liquid emotionally as well as financially, never committing, never connecting, never allowing herself to be tied to places or people or institutions that might make claims on her resources. The suspicion this generated was perhaps inevitable. Americans have always been ambivalent about wealth, celebrating success while mistrusting those who hoard rather than spend. The industrialists who built libraries and universities and concert halls earned grudging admiration for returning something to society. Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth argued explicitly that the rich had obligations to use their fortunes for public benefit. Those who failed to fulfill these obligations, who accumulated without visible reinvestment, became objects of resentment rather than respect. Hetty Green became such an object. Her fortune, invisible and intangible, seemed to serve no purpose beyond its own growth. She employed few people, built nothing, donated little, contributed no visible improvement to the world around her. The money existed only as numbers in ledgers, growing steadily but producing nothing that others could see or share. In a society that measured success partly by what the successful gave back, she gave nothing and was judged accordingly. Whether this judgment was fair remains debatable. Hetty Green owed nothing to the public that mocked her. She had earned her fortune legally through shrewd investment and patient accumulation, and she had every right to dispose of it as she chose. The expectation that the wealthy should perform their wealth for public approval was itself a kind of taxation, an unwritten demand that success be accompanied by visible display. Hetty's refusal to comply was, in its way, a declaration of independence, a statement that she would live according to her own values rather than those imposed by society or demanded by the newspapers that vilified her. But independence carried its own costs. The isolation, the damaged relationships, the children who never quite recovered from their upbringing, the legacy of mockery rather than admiration. These were the prices Hetty paid for her freedom. She died with her fortune intact, but her reputation in ruins, her name forever synonymous with miserliness. She had won the financial battle and lost something harder to define. The witch had her gold. What she did not have was anything else. A century after her death, visitors can tour the Biltmore estate in Asheville, North Carolina, walking through rooms where the Vanderbilt family once entertained their guests. They can wander the gardens, admire the architecture, and purchase souvenirs that fund the ongoing preservation of America's largest private residence. In Newport, the Preservation Society maintains a collection of Gilded Age cottages, Marble House, the Breakers, Rosecliff, where tourists experience the vanished world of summer society. On Fifth Avenue, the mansions have mostly fallen, but those that survive house museums and cultural institutions that keep the memories of their builders alive. These monuments of stone and mortar endure because someone chose to preserve them, because they represented something worth remembering, because architecture has a permanence that outlasts the families who commission it. There is no Hetty Green mansion to visit. There is no estate where docents explain how she lived, no preserved rooms displaying her furniture and possessions, no gift shop selling reproductions of her famous black dress. The woman who accumulated one of the largest fortunes in American history left behind no physical monument whatsoever. Her legacy exists in ledgers and lawsuits, in newspaper clippings and financial records, in the memories of a fortune that grew and then dispersed into the vast American economy from which it came. She built an empire of paper, and paper, unlike marble, does not endure. What happened to the money itself? The fortune that Hetty spent a lifetime accumulating was divided between her two children upon her death in 1916. Ned received approximately half. Estimates vary, but figures around $100 million appear in most accounts, and proceeded to spend it with enthusiasm that would have horrified his mother. His collections, his estates, his radio experiments, his fleets of automobiles and yachts consumed capital at a prodigious rate. When he died in 1936, the estate that remained was substantial but diminished, tangled in claims and disputes that took years to resolve. The collections were auctioned, the properties were sold. The fortune that Hetty had built through decades of patient accumulation dispersed in the matter of years. Sylvia fared somewhat better as a steward of wealth. Her share of the inheritance, managed conservatively in the manner her mother would have approved, grew modestly through the decades. She lived comfortably but without extravagance, maintaining the patterns of her upbringing even after she was free to abandon them. When she died in 1951, at the age of 80, She left an estate valued at approximately $90 million, a figure that suggests careful preservation rather than aggressive growth. The bulk of her fortune passed to charitable institutions and distant relatives, scattered across beneficiaries who had no particular connection to the Green family legacy. Within a generation of Hetty's death, the fortune she had built was effectively gone. Not squandered entirely, but dispersed, divided, absorbed into trusts and estates and charitable funds that bore no trace of her name or her principles. The money continued to exist, in some abstract sense, circulating through the economy as all money does. But the concentrated wealth that had made her one of the richest people in America had ceased to exist as a unified entity. The empire of paper had dissolved. This dissolution raises uncomfortable questions about the meaning of financial success. Hetty Green devoted her entire adult life to accumulation, sacrificing comfort, relationships, and reputation in pursuit of ever larger numbers in her account books. She endured public ridicule, family conflict, and profound isolation. She denied herself pleasures that people of far lesser means enjoyed without a second thought. And within 20 years of her death, the fortune that had justified all these sacrifices had fragmented beyond recognition. Was the accumulation worth the cost if the accumulated wealth could not survive even a single generation? The comparison with her mansion-building contemporaries is instructive. The Vanderbilt fortune, like the Green fortune, has largely dispersed. The family that once dominated American wealth produced descendants who struggled financially, who sold off properties and heirlooms, who became footnotes rather than protagonists in American history. With the Vanderbilts left behind buildings built more, the breakers, the surviving mansions that now function as museums and monuments. These structures preserve something of the family's memory, ensuring that visitors will continue to learn their names for generations to come. The architecture outlasted the fortune. Hetty Green left no such monuments. Her memory survives not in stone, but in story, the legend of the Witch of Wall Street, the tales of pathological frugality, the anecdotes about oatmeal heated on radiators and legs lost to parsimony. These stories are her architecture, the structures that preserve her name in public memory. They are not flattering structures. They present her as a cautionary tale rather than a model, as a warning about what wealth can do to a person rather than an inspiration for what wealth can accomplish. But they endure, passed from generation to generation, retold in books and articles and now documentaries that find in her strange life something worth examining. Perhaps this is its own form of legacy. The mansions of the Gilded Age require constant maintenance, millions of dollars annually to preserve roofs and facades, to restore deteriorating interiors, to keep the physical structures from collapsing into ruin. The preservation societies that maintain these properties struggle constantly for funding, knowing that without perpetual investment, the buildings will crumble. Architecture demands ongoing stewardship. Stories, by contrast, require only retelling. They preserve themselves through human interests, through the endless fascination with lives that defy ordinary patterns. Hetty Green's legend maintains itself without endowment or foundation, sustained by the simple fact that people continue to find her interesting. Was she successful in her mission? The answer depends on how one defines her goals. If her purpose was to accumulate wealth and preserve it for future generations, she partially succeeded. Her children inherited vast sums that would have secured comfort for their descendants indefinitely, had those descendants existed, and had the money been managed according to her principles. But Ned had no legitimate children, and Sylvia's marriage produced none either. The Green line ended with them. There were no grandchildren to inherit, no dynasty to perpetuate, no family to carry the accumulated capital into future centuries. The fortune she built so carefully had nowhere to go. If her purpose was simply to accumulate to watch the numbers grow, to feel the satisfaction of assets multiplying, then perhaps she succeeded completely. She died richer than almost anyone in America, her fortune intact, her principles uncompromised. She had proven that a woman could master the financial markets, could compete with the titans of Wall Street and win. She had demonstrated that discipline and patience could outperform speculation and display. These achievements were real, regardless of what happened after her death. The accumulation was the point. What came later was someone else's concern. There is something almost philosophical in this position. Most people accumulate wealth for purposes beyond the accumulation itself. Security, comfort, status, the welfare of descendants. Hetty Green seemed to find the process itself sufficient. The growing numbers were their own reward. The fortune existed not to buy things or impress people or provide for future generations, but simply to exist, to grow. to demonstrate what careful stewardship could accomplish. In this sense, her success was complete the moment she died. Everything after that was irrelevant. And yet something troubles this conclusion. A life devoted entirely to accumulation, without any larger purpose or connection, seems impoverished regardless of the numbers involved. Hetty Green died rich and alone, feared rather than loved, mocked rather than admired. Her children were damaged by the household she created. Her marriage failed. Her reputation became a cautionary tale. She left no monument, no institution, no visible contribution to the world that had made her fortune possible. The money passed through her like water through a channel, leaving no permanent mark on the landscape. The Gilded Age mansions that tourists visit today represent something more than vanity. They employed thousands of craftsmen, preserved artistic traditions, created spaces of beauty that continue to inspire. They contributed to the communities that surrounded them, providing employment and economic activity. They expressed their builders' personalities, their aspirations, their understanding of what wealth should accomplish. Hetty Green's fortune did none of these things. It accumulated silently, invisibly, purposelessly, and then dispersed. What remains is the story. A woman in a black dress, carrying battered bags full of securities, arguing over pennies while her fortune climbed toward $100 million. A childhood in Quaker counting houses, a brutal will contest, a marriage that collapsed under the weight of suspicion and control. Children raised cold and patched amid unimaginable wealth, a legend that outlasted every mansion of her era. Perhaps that is enough. The Witch of Wall Street built no palace, but she built something that has proven equally durable, a mystery that continues to fascinate, a paradox that refuses easy resolution, a life that still raises questions about what money means and what it costs. She mastered the architecture of finance while refusing the architecture of stone. She left no marble monument, only a story that still unsettles and fascinates a century after her death.